Yeah, so hello everyone. This is my first time doing this talk, rate limiting, the art of saying no. So just a little intro. You heard a little bit about me, but my name is TJ. I'm a software developer at Botpress. I haven't been here too long in the industry, but I've touched a lot of different parts. That includes startups, the telecom world, government. I've done some freelance work. But my passion really lies in building tech communities, like talking at events like these. So a little bit about what we're going to get into. Hopefully enough that's some things that everyone in this room will understand. We'll start off with why rate limiting exists and a real world example. We'll get into the algorithms. We'll get into a little bit more complex part about rate limiting and hopefully a conclusion that you all will understand. So why does rate limit exist? I want to paint you guys a little picture. I want to tell you a big story. But to do that, I'll need to introduce you guys to some characters in my story. So my first one, a kind of fictional Schmistofer Schrass. So he does freelance security at the RL company, and he's sent to different locations every single day. And this day, he's outside of a nightclub. His rule is really simple. Let 10 people in with no exceptions. Now, this is really simple, a really easy task, but he's going to have a new task soon. But to do that, I'll have to provide some new context about a guy you might know. This is Barack Obama. And on March 23rd, 2010, he passed the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. A couple years later, in 2013, the head of engineering at the White House, announced that every single American, regardless of their income, will be able to go to Healthcare.gov and compare healthcare plans, and low-income Americans may qualify for free healthcare. You can imagine that for people who are facing their highest expense after taxes, this is a pretty promising offer to them. They can lower their expenses greatly. He's probably thinking to himself, I just launched a great platform, and I'm so smart. Well, there's a little bit of a problem. Every American has heard about this by now, and lots of them want to access this as soon as possible, including a lot of elderly folk who are leaving the bingo hall. That brings us to François Chavasseur, who's an old grandpa from Lavaseur, Louisiana. He tries to get on the site, and as you can tell, he's really not happy. He's spamming refresh, and he's old as hell. And why is he spamming refresh? He should be enjoying all the free healthcare benefits he should be getting, right? Unfortunately not, because he's looking at this screen. The system is down at the moment. We're working to resolve the issue as soon as possible. Please try again later. This is a real screenshot that millions of Americans viewed for days as they were trying to get free healthcare. So let's take Healthcare.gov and let's make it a building. Let's say that instead of a bunch of people accessing this via a website, they're lined up outside this building. There's a really long sidewalk that they can all just go down. This is great. Perfect. So let's say we don't have Schmistofer, our freelance security guard from earlier. Well, there's a bit of chaos going on here. I mean, hell, the building's full. The dozens of people who are trying to help can only help one person at a time, and they're overloaded. They're overwhelmed. There's tears, and there's something going on in the corner that I don't think I want to talk about. But with Schmistofer, there's a controlled line. The agents are able to handle someone one by one, and you get Schmistofer. So Healthcare.gov did not just crash because too many people showed up. It crashed because no one had the forethought to think about what too many even meant. So what did Healthcare.gov need? They needed protection. The building should not just collapse into chaos because too many people showed up. It should be fair, and everyone should wait in the line, first come, first serve, and get the service they need. And it needs to be predictable. Chaos is the enemy of planning. So how do we do it, and how do we do it right? Let's get into the algorithms. There's a few that you can use, and I'll start off quite simple with fixed window. This declares a set time frame. In this case, you'll see that it's midnight to midnight, so this would be 1 day. And you would divide the time into fixed buckets, where each bucket has a counter. When a request comes in, you can increment the counter, and when the counter hits the limit, you reject until the next window. This seems fine at first, but there is a problem. A boundary spike. So at your limit on each day, if you capture all of your requests and send them at the very end of each time frame, you could burst a request and then send a lot of them right at the beginning of the following day. So at 11:59, you use all your requests, and at 12 a.m., you redo it again. This is bursty by design, and the window has no idea of what happened. So let's improve this a little bit. Let's opt for a sliding window. So instead of fixed buckets, we'll track the exact timestamp of every request. When a new one comes in, instead of just looking at today, let's just look at the last 24 hours since the request. We'll count the requests in that range, and if they're under the limit, we'll allow. and if not, we'll reject. This still has a problem of that bursty effect, and it's a bit memory hungry because you're storing these single timestamp per user and per endpoint. So let's go to something that we could use instead. How about a token bucket? In this case, you'll see this token on the right side of the GIF, which fills with these green balls. If it overflows, you just lose those requests. But if you do have requests available, you can send them. And if not, they're rejected. The problem is that burst behavior can still spike your backend if you're not tuned carefully. And now you have two parameters to tune. You have both the capacity of the bucket and the refill rate, which you could both get wrong and negatively impact your system. And this is where clock drift and race conditions can matter a lot, which we'll talk about later. So another solution to this would be a leaky bucket. The idea is that requests go into a queue, which is the bucket itself, and they're processed at a fixed constant rate with no exceptions. If the bucket is full, the new requests are dropped. This is great if you can't tolerate spikes, like you have a payment processor or a third-party API you're calling, but bursts can get flattened even if your backend can support them. And the queue adds latency, requests wait instead of being rejected fast. So now that we've gone over the algorithms, there's other options in various complexities and different reasons to which you'd want to use them. Let's get towards some of the harder parts. So to get everyone on the same side, or on the same page, a race condition, in this case for Redis, would look like you had two system threads, A and B. They can both check and increment the counter. So if they both read the same value, which would be 9, and your rate limit is 10, they will both say, hey, I can increment prior to each other incrementing. And now they've both checked, yep, 9, I'm good, 9, I'm good. And when they increment, now your counter is at 10 and then 11, and boom, you've limited your own breach within your code, even though it is technically correct. So a good solution to this is to use Lua. Redis is single-threaded. It is a key-value pair collection, and Lua would, by its very nature, make the operations atomic, which will block all other commands until completion. Luckily, if you don't know how to use Lua, this is fine. Depending on your ecosystem, there's very many packages that could assist you. So for Node, there's rate limiter flexible. For Python, there's limits. And if you're a .NET user, there's system.threading.ratelimiting. And I guarantee you, whatever ecosystem you're looking at, there is a rate limiting package that will wrap Lua for you. So now it's time to choose a Redis topology. So this is not too hard of a choice, but if you're making a rate limiter, the implications can be very big on your application. So let's talk about a single node. This is your more traditional Redis setup. All your app servers point at it. It's simple and atomic. But if Redis goes down, your entire rate limiter goes down with it. And what you'll do when Redis goes down is something that we'll have to discuss later. But there's no replication lag, there's no split brain, there's no slot routing. What you see is what you get. And it's fine for most use cases until you need high availability. So what are your other options? There's a cluster where it shards your key space over 16,384 slots, and each node of Redis owns a slice, and they each hold a replica. So if one goes down, in the time where you have to hoist your next replica, that part will be inaccessible for a few seconds. This is okay, but it's not great if you need to access those nodes during promotion. Another alternative to this is Sentinel. So Sentinel is an automatic failover. So several Sentinels will watch your reads and writes. There will be replicas, and when your Redis inevitably will go down at some point, it will promote a replica based on a consensus vote from the Sentinels. This also takes 15 to 30 seconds, and during that time, your Redis can be inaccessible, and you might lose a few of the reads and writes that you would have gotten during that time frame. So what will you do when Redis dies? There's a few options. The most common ones you'll hear will be fail open or fail closed. What are the benefits? If you fail open, your users will remain unaffected. They can still use your platform, but your backend is exposed during the entire outage window, meaning you're vulnerable to sophisticated attackers who know that infrastructure can go down during some points. If you fail closed, however, you're issuing 429s to an infrastructure that's a mistake that's yours. Your backend is closed, your SaaS would be closed, and it can cascade, because if you use Redis on all your API paths, which you should, it becomes a full-on outage. So the alternative to this would be to use a circuit breaker. You have 5 questions to ask yourself when designing your circuit breaker, however. What would be your failure threshold? What will trip the breaker into going into effect? For our answer, we can say that we would use an error rate of more than 50%, because using a raw count is volume sensitive, and is not a great metric. You would use a timeout. How long do you stay open? We can start at 5 seconds and then back off exponentially. And how do we test recovery? We don't want to remain on this circuit breaker forever. We want to eventually open up. And so we can send probe requests to see if Redis is back online and redirect our data back there. For fallback, this is important where you know the limits of your system and stress test your systems, because you're going to want a pre-tuned in-memory limit. This is how much your backend can take all in one go. No matter who the user is, no matter how much usage they're allotted, how much can your backend take? This is important to know prior to your outage so you can systematically make a fallback. And should you have one breaker or many? These are all questions you have to ask yourself when you're designing a circuit breaker for your rate limiter. It's also important to keep in mind hierarchical rate limiting. This could be relevant depending on your platform. So if you're designing an enterprise application, you might need a service limit on the bottom, which would protect the infrastructure regardless of who's asking. That's sort of the global rate limiter that I was discussing earlier. You might also have a tenant or some sort of organization who's using your platform. This could be some sort of team plan with multiple users within it. You want to make sure that they're not taking too much advantage of the system. And then the users within that team. And you even might want to have one per endpoint. This all depends on your system. Now, you can check if you really need to check each one, or you can do some of them probabilistically, like only checking 10% or writing 10% of your global requests instead of all your requests as a whole. I'd also like to note to be smart with your keys. This is something that I've seen kind of everywhere that I've ever worked in code. Always set your TTL or your time to live for the key on creation atomically. And because if you have no TTL, your memory will just continue to balloon as your keys never expire. If they're too short, your counter will reset. And they should always equal your window duration if you're doing a sliding window or a fixed window. And cardinality is also something that seems really simple and really trivial. People will just sort of choose one at odds, but this can be pretty dangerous. So if you have 10,000 tenants, 50 endpoints, and 10,000 users, this could mean 5 billion possible keys. Depending on which are cold and which are hot, Redis still needs to manage the TTLs in the memory for each key that you're inputting. So you need to think, do I actually need the key to be this specific, or can I make it more broad as a whole so Redis doesn't need to manage so much in its memory? So hotspot keys relates a lot more to that global rate limiting that I was discussing earlier. If you want to globally rate limit your system, Redis is single-threaded, and at high throughput, they must compete for the key. And if you have 50,000 to 100,000 requests coming across your platform, they will all need to compete for that single key, and that can become a bit of a bottleneck. So if they're all going to have to wait in a queue, and you've built the mutex in your hot path. To do this, you can do counter sharding, which is where you split up among multiple shards and then read those shards periodically and increment a global counter that way. This way, you're not competing for one key at the same time. You've distributed that over multiple keys, and you can implement your global this way and not be as blocked. Last thing I discussed a little bit earlier, I used a term clock drift. Just to explain that, in a distributed system, each server will have its own system clock, but inevitably those clocks will not be the exact same. They will not be perfectly in sync. Occasionally they'll go by milliseconds, and the simple solution to this is to use the time in Redis as a source of truth. Instead of relying on your app server's clock, you can use the Redis time command in order to get the current timestamp and deal with it that way. So to conclude, I want to go over some things that everyone should note, and you'll experience these whether you're a user or a developer interacting with a rate limiter. But UX, coming from a back-end engineer, so take this with a grain of salt, if you're running a paid SaaS, your users probably have a right to know how much of a quota they're using. They're paying a lot of money for your service, and if they're hitting the rate limits consistently, that can be a pretty frustrating experience. So it could be nice to return headers, including a rate limit header, how much is remaining in your rate limit, when it resets, and maybe even what plan they're on. If you're using a free SaaS and your rules are publicly available, you're just sort of asking for it to be abused. So in that case, you don't need to return the exact limits or even the exact reset times necessarily. But something like the response on screen, which shows you to retry after maybe 60 seconds or something like that, could work fine. But make sure not to keep yourself too vulnerable to DDoS attacks that way. There's also a couple other things to consider. These are sort of miscellaneous, but before you give a 429 directly and cut someone off from using your service, it might be useful to give them an X rate limit warning header when the user is approaching their quota. This way you can warn them that, hey, you're approaching your quota. And if they're if they're developing a smart system, they'll be able to recognize that and adapt correctly. It also could be nice to return a valuable body in your payload so that they know what they're dealing with, maybe a correct error message, and even a link to your docs to discuss more about how your rate limiter works on your platform specifically. It's also important to be able to observe your rate limiter. So, if you have your memory usage, because your cardinality is too specific, like we discussed earlier, this is an important thing to note, and your memory usage will shoot up, and it's important that you're able to observe that before your Redis just goes down. If you're hitting key space misses a lot, that could mean that your TTL is a little bit too long, or a little bit too short, forgive me, and you might want to increase that. It's also important to note that if you have evicted keys enabled, which it is by default, this could be very dangerous for your rate limiter because under memory pressure, Redis will choose to just delete cold keys from your key store, and that could be pretty dangerous. So you'd want to set that to no eviction and monitor to make sure that you're not losing keys. And if you're using a Sentinel, replication lag will tell you how stale your replicas are to make sure that in case Redis does go down, you'll be able to restore from a better point. For alerts, you'll want to know if your Redis is down. So if your rejection rate is higher than X% for Y minutes, you'll know that either you're under attack and you're getting a lot of rejections, or a limit is misconfigured and you should probably fix your limits a bit more. It's also important to make sure your rate limiter is fast because it should be running on most of your requests, so to make sure that it's going quickly. You should be alerted if your circuit breaker goes on because you're likely also under attack, or your Redis is down, forgive me. And if your fallback is active for more than a minute, you should be aware of that as well. A great log would include the following. So the key of the user, the event that happened, they exceeded their rate limit, who they are, how much they had in their limit, how long was this window, what the current count of their requests are. If they're only surpassing it by a little bit, you don't need to know, and their endpoint. It's important not to include any like IP or user info for compliancy. Unless you're using Delve, then you were never compliant to begin with, and you can just give up. Like, it's fine. So the key takeaways would be that rate limiting exists to protect your infrastructure and ensure fairness, and Healthcare.gov learned this the hard way. If the White House can do it, we can all do it. There's naive implementations have really, really core issues that will only show at the worst time. When you're under attack, when your systems are down, you're gonna wanna prepare for that ahead of time. Similar to to point 3, when Redis dies, you'll need a plan made that you have before the outage on how to handle these circumstances. Even if you have the most excellently designed rate limiter, it's important to know if Redis goes down, what are we gonna do? And key design is an afterthought until cardinality explodes, so make sure to plan that ahead of time on each key. It can seem something like super simple that Claude will generate until you have trillions of keys. And a 429 is a communication. Once again, UX tips coming from a backend engineer, but it's important to know how you're gonna respond to the user as it reflects the maturity of your platform. They should know what they're getting. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of MTL code. I hope you have a great time.